What happens when a successful CEO goes undercover and faces discrimination in his own store? It was just after 10 a.m. on a Saturday when Mark Simmons adjusted his baseball cap in the rearview mirror of his car. The man he saw staring back at him was barely recognizable. Not the CEO who had built a multi-million-dollar retail empire, but just another face in the crowd. His hoodie and jeans were a far cry from the sharp suits he usually wore. Today, he wasn't focused on boardrooms or numbers. Today, he was stepping into his own world without anyone knowing who he was. He wanted to see what it looked like through the eyes of a regular customer. Mark had always believed in building connections, and his company was based on the idea that every customer mattered, no matter their background. But recently, complaints had been surfacing about poor service, bias, and a lack of care from his staff. If there was any truth to these rumors, he needed to experience it firsthand, not as the CEO, but as a regular person. While talking to a customer about the product features, the stock clerk moved around the shelves, rearranging items with an efficient yet distant air. At the far end of the store, a younger employee stood leaning against the counter of the electronics section, mindlessly scrolling through his phone. Mark decided to head in that direction. He casually walked through the aisles, moving at the pace of any ordinary shopper. He picked up a pair of headphones, pretending to consider buying them. It was a simple test. Would the employee notice him? Would he offer help, a smile, anything? But nothing came. The young man didn't even glance up. Mark stood there, giving the employee every chance to engage, but still, nothing. A knot of discomfort formed in his stomach, but he held off on jumping to conclusions. Maybe the employee was busy, maybe he didn't see him. He moved on, continuing to scan the aisles, watching how others interacted. He spotted an older woman near the home goods section, looking frustrated as she glanced around for help. Before Mark could step in to see what would happen, another employee approached her, cheerful and ready to assist. Her face softened in relief as they began talking. It was a stark contrast to his own experience. But when Mark turned back to the electronics counter, determined to give the young man another chance, what happened next made it clear this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger. Mark returned to the counter, this time holding a boxed set of Bluetooth speakers. He placed the box on the counter gently, hoping the action would catch the employee's attention. Finally, the young man looked up, his face blank and uninterested. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone making it obvious he didn't care to help. Mark smiled, trying to ease the tension. "Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell me more about these. Are they good for outdoor use?" The employee glanced at the box, shrugged, and said, "I don't know. Probably." His gaze quickly returned to his phone. Mark blinked, surprised, and asked, "Could you maybe check? I want to be sure before I buy them." The employee sighed heavily, like Mark was asking for too much. Without saying anything, he grabbed the box, flipped it over, and mumbled, "It says here, they're weatherproof," handing it back with no further explanation. Mark felt a wave of frustration but kept his voice calm. "Okay, and do you know if they're compatible with most devices?" The employee rolled his eyes. "Look, man, all the details are right here on the box. You can read it yourself." He waved vaguely toward the shelf. "Or pick something else, doesn't matter to me." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the hum of the store. Mark could feel the tension building in his own body. This wasn't just poor service. It was something more. It was outright dismissiveness. Mark looked around, noticing that other customers were being treated warmly and enthusiastically by employees. A white couple near the front was getting personalized help from the same young man who had assisted the older woman earlier. Yet here he was, barely acknowledged. Trying to stay composed, Mark decided to test the situation further. "You seem busy," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Is there someone else who might be able to help?" The employee smirked, his mouth curling with disdain. "I don't think anyone's free right now. Just figure it out, all right?" The words stung more than Mark expected. He wasn't angry, not yet, just disappointed. This wasn't just bad service, it was something deeper, something uglier. And it wasn't just about him. If this was how the employee treated someone he thought was an ordinary shopper, how many others had walked out of this store feeling the same cold indifference? Before Mark could respond, the young man turned away, grabbed his phone, and walked toward the back of the store. Mark stood there, frozen, holding the box of speakers. For a moment he considered walking out, but quickly dismissed the thought. He wasn't finished yet. What Mark didn't realize was that this moment of dismissiveness would soon reveal something much more troubling about the culture he thought he had built. Mark set the speakers back on the shelf, his mind racing. The encounter wasn't just unprofessional, it felt personal. He decided to explore the store further, watching how other employees interacted with customers. If this was just one bad experience, he needed to be sure. If it wasn't, he had a much bigger issue on his hands. He walked into the clothing section, where a young Latina employee was folding shirts at a display. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Let me know if you need help with anything," she said. It was a sharp contrast to the cold reception he had just experienced. Mark lingered, pretending to browse, and noticed her helping an elderly man nearby. She was patient, attentive, and even suggested a matching tie. The man's gratitude was clear, and the interaction gave Mark a flicker of hope. Maybe the store wasn't completely off track. But as he moved toward the home goods section, a conversation stopped him in his tracks. Two young employees were casually leaning against a shelf, whispering to each other in a way that was unmistakably disrespectful. "That guy over there," one of them said, subtly nodding toward Mark, "is probably just here to browse. People like him never buy anything big." Mark's jaw tightened as he pretended to look at a set of pots and pans. The other employee laughed. "Yeah, he doesn't look like he's got the cash for this stuff. Probably just wasting time." It was a gut punch. They had no idea who he was. To them, he was just another black man in the store, someone they assumed couldn't afford anything. The casual way they dismissed him said it all. It wasn't just one bad employee, it was a culture. Mark stayed quiet, resisting the urge to confront the employees right then. Instead, he made his way to the checkout area, determined to observe more before addressing the issue. At the register, he found a middle-aged black woman named Denise, ringing up customers with a kind and professional demeanor. Mark watched as she greeted each person with a smile, her voice steady and warm. When it was his turn, she looked up and smiled. "Did you find everything okay?" she asked. "Not exactly," Mark replied, his tone calm. "I think I'll hold off for now." Denise's smile faltered just a bit, but she nodded. "Well, if you need anything, just let us know. We're here to help." Her sincerity was clear, and for a moment, it lifted some of the weight off Mark's chest. It was obvious not everyone at the store shared the same dismissive attitude, but it also pointed out the inconsistency. Why were some employees so welcoming, while others were so openly biased? As Mark walked out of the store, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on, and he knew it was time to face the truth. He sat in his car, the afternoon heat pressing against the windows. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring at the store with his company's logo on it. It felt surreal. This business, his pride and joy, was supposed to stand for opportunity, fairness, and respect. Yet, the experiences he'd just had painted a different picture, one he wasn't prepared for, but couldn't ignore. The dismissive attitude from the electronics employee stayed in his mind, but it was the casual comments he overheard in the home goods section that hurt the most. These weren't isolated incidents. They pointed to a deeper issue within his company's culture, one that had gone unchecked. Mark thought back to the early days of the business when he personally trained every manager and hired staff based on shared values. Back then, he emphasized the importance of treating every customer like family, no matter who they were or how much they spent. But as the company grew, those personal touches became harder to maintain. Delegation had been necessary, but had it come at the cost of the values he had worked so hard to instill? Mark wondered if he'd grown too distant from the day-to-day operations. Success had brought expansion, but it had also created blind spots. Were his managers fostering an environment of respect, or were they turning a blind eye to subtle prejudices and unprofessionalism? Had he failed to give his employees the tools to combat bias and treat everyone equally? He took a deep breath, replaying the earlier interactions in his mind. Denise, the kind cashier, had reminded him of what his business should stand for. Yet employees like her were being overshadowed by those who didn't share her values. It wasn't just about the customer experience. It was about the culture he had allowed to grow. Mark reached for his notebook in the glove compartment and wrote down his thoughts. This wasn't just about fixing one store. It was about ensuring that every employee at every location understood the responsibility of representing the core values of his company. Mark knew it was time for accountability from the top down, but before he could make changes, he knew there was one more step to take, a step that would show how deep the problem really was and challenge those at the heart of it. Mark walked back into the store with quiet determination. He wasn't here to create a scene or embarrass anyone. This wasn't about ego. It was about addressing a culture that had gone off track. He headed toward the customer service desk and asked to speak with the store manager. After a few moments, a man in his late 40s approached. His name tag read Brian, and he had a professional but slightly wary demeanor. "How can I help you today?" he asked. Mark extended his hand. "Mark Johnson," he said, watching as Brian's eyes widened with recognition. "I'm the owner of this store." The manager's composure faltered for a brief moment. Then he recovered. "Mr. Johnson, it's an honor to meet you. If I'd known you were visiting—" Mark raised a hand to stop him. "That's the point, Brian. You weren't supposed to know. I came here as a regular customer to see how things are really running, and what I saw today, it wasn't good." Brian's face reddened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me what happened?" Mark recounted the events of the day, the indifference from the electronics employee, the overheard comments, and the glaring differences in how customers were treated. He spoke calmly but firmly, his words filled with disappointment. "This isn't just about one bad employee," he said. "It's about a culture that lets this kind of behavior happen. I built this company on the idea that every customer deserves respect no matter who they are. Today I saw the opposite of that." Brian shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't aware of these issues. I've always tried to ensure our team follows the company's values." Mark nodded. "I believe you, but clearly something is slipping through the cracks. And it's not just your responsibility, it's mine too. Somewhere along the way, I've let the values I built this company on get diluted. That ends today." He asked Brian to gather the staff for an impromptu meeting in the break room. Within minutes, the employees were gathered, their faces filled with curiosity and anxiety. Mark stood before them, not just another customer, but the leader they hadn't expected to see. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Johnson. I'm the founder and CEO of this company. Today, I came here undercover to see how things are really running on the ground." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Mark took a moment to look at each face before continuing. "What I saw today was troubling. Some of you showed kindness and professionalism, the kind of attitude this company was built on. But others Others failed to meet even the most basic standard of respect. And that failure isn't just on you, it's on me for not making sure our culture stays consistent. He turned to the young electronics employee, who now looked pale and nervous. You dismissed me, ignored me, and made it clear I wasn't worth your time. That's unacceptable. But feel a flicker of optimism. The journey ahead would require effort and persistence, but he knew it was worth it. He had taken the first step, not as a CEO, but as a leader who recognized that success wasn't just measured by profits. It was measured by the integrity of the business and the treatment of every person who walked through the door. Terence was determined to rebuild the culture he had once envisioned, one based on respect, fairness, and genuine connection. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. As he drove away, his thoughts lingered on the faces of the employees, the ones who were willing to change and the ones who still needed a wake-up call. He knew the work wasn't done, but now he was no longer just a figurehead. He was a part of the solution. He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching his own reflection, not as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, but as a man with a responsibility to lead with integrity and heart. Terence wasn't just driving away from the store. He was driving toward a new vision, one where the values he had built his empire on would shine through, no matter how much the company grew. But feel a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that sometimes facing uncomfortable truths was the only way to progress. Every step toward change began with someone willing to take the first one. If this story struck a chord with you, remember that even the smallest actions can spark the biggest change. Treat others with kindness, stand up when you witness injustice, and always work toward a more fair and compassionate world. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change.